Christine, I wanted to first and foremost thank you for making the time to join us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think as most folks on the call know, we bring on amazing people like Christine to talk about their creative process, a lot of the work that they've put out into the world, and talk about some of the, whatever challenges and the journey of writing and producing creative work. So the full backstory, Christine, of me finding your work was a late night Google search when I just had this random thought, like, has anybody produced the defining documentary about what I think is a very important question of history, which is how did language come about? And like, what is the story of language? There's been obviously many books written about it, but as my Google search went deeper and deeper, I was unable to find anything until finally stumbling across the series that you made about a decade ago called Speaking in Tongues. For anyone who is not already familiar with it, I just have to call it an ambitious project where Christine put together a documentary series tracing the beginning of language from its very earliest origins through essentially today, where she interviewed folks like Noam Chomsky, other linguists, and weaved together this huge story into this very succinct, powerful, and memorable series. So we're going to talk a lot about that project in particular, but Christine's done a hell of a lot more than that. But Christine, I was going to open with a very basic question, which is what impact did growing up in Regent Park in Toronto kind of have on your career and some of your work?
Okay, so let me just give you some background. So Regent Park is Toronto's oldest and largest low-income community, social housing. And I came, hi, so someone's from the Toronto. Hi. So I moved into Regent Park at the age of 5 and moved out at the age of 20. So 15 years I was there. So it had a very strong impact on me as a person and me as an artist as well too. So I can say wholeheartedly that everything that I've done, all my work has been informed by my living in Regent Park. I started making films in Regent Park. So the very first documentaries that I made were part of the Regent Park Video Workshop. And I actually learned how to make my first documentaries there. So that alone in itself was very impactful. When I started writing my novels, the characters that were coming to me were characters that I had met growing up in Regent Park. Very strong characters, funny, rich, people from all over the world lived in Regent Park. And yeah, so it gave me a lot and it formed my work. And I don't think I would be the person I am today had I not grown up in Regent Park.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm almost gonna go in reverse order here, which we'll see if this works or not, because I want to talk about some of the novels you've written. I want to even talk about the most recent documentary you did about Regent Park. And I think that'll be really fun. But maybe because it's the first piece of work that I got introduced to of yours, and certainly the one I know best, I'd love to start with your experience producing, directing, writing, Speaking in Tongues. And again, this is the sweeping history and story of the development of human language. And from the outside, this just seems like such a huge undertaking from someone who's never had this level of ambition with my work. So maybe we'll start at the very beginning. I'm curious how that project came about.
So yeah, it was a huge thing. And yeah, so it came about because Omni Television, television station, a multilingual television station based in Toronto, they put a call out for documentaries in third languages, meaning languages that weren't English or French. And I didn't have a project at the time in a third language, but I had this fascination with language. From the time I was very young, I had this fascination with languages. I didn't have any kind of background in linguistics at all, nothing, zero background in linguistics. So what I did was that I did a really crash course, spending, a week maybe so looking at the internet and putting together a proposal about what I would see like a series that spoke about language, the history of language. And I thought that this would be really great for the Omni television because it was a multilingual. And I said, why not look at all languages, instead of just looking at one language and, so I did this crash course and put together a really, I guess, slick proposal and submitted to them. And lo and behold, they said, oh, we're interested. And so that's how I started with that particular project. And then once I got the green light, it was okay, now I really have to do this. And I didn't know anything. So I would say I spent about a year, one full year doing the research in order to understand everything that I needed to understand to make the documentary, because I knew that I wanted to get the top linguists in the world in this documentary. And so in order to speak to them, I had to know what they were going to tell me. So there's this thing when I do my interview workshops, I tell my students that you need to know the answers to the question before you ask the questions. So I needed to know the answers to these questions. So that's why I had to spend that amount of time doing the research. So it was almost like one full year doing the research, and that was, just the different aspects. And what I found that linguistics is a very splintered field. Like someone who does like phonics or someone who does the say Creoles, they don't speak to each other. So there's just so many different branches of linguistics, and none of them really speak to each other, so it's very specialized. Everyone is very specialized. So I had to go into almost every specialty to find out, what I needed to learn to put this documentary together. And so after I did the initial research, then I started reaching out to the linguists themselves. And that was pretty simple. I had written another proposal, a long proposal. Then I had submitted to the broadcaster to begin with. And luckily, everyone who I wanted to be involved got involved, and we made the documentary. And it was, yeah. And so
Oh yeah,
okay,
Christine, feel
I'm just
free.
reading, yeah, yeah.
Totally. I'll be our chat police here, and I'll integrate some of the questions that pop up.
Okay,
Feel
great,
free
great,
to.
great.
Yeah,
So
I'll be
because
our
I get
mediator.
distracted when I see text, I have to read text. So I don't know.
Like any good
Yeah,
reader.
yeah. So I got in contact with these linguists, the experts, and the majority of them were American. Obviously, I don't know why, if that's all, but most of them were American. So we shot in 18 days, and I went to all these different universities all over the States, and captured these linguists. And yeah, and it was an interesting process, and I learned a lot. And one of the last interviews was with Noam Chomsky. And the way I prepared for that is that everyone who preceded Noam Chomsky, I would tell, okay, I'm going to be interviewing Noam Chomsky, you know, in a few weeks or whatever, a few days. And they said, well, you need to ask him this question, you need to ask him that question, you need to approach him this way, you need to. So I was very prepared when I got to Noam Chomsky. So yeah, that was great. It was a great experience.
Yeah, you make it sound far too easy, because I just can't imagine the undertaking that some of this was. And I love that you say you spent a full year just doing the research
Yeah.
before lining up these interviews. And something I was curious to dive in on, you mentioned how splintered linguistics is, and all these different deep experts on these various topics maybe. But I've always thought that very often a writer's job is seeing the forest from the trees and tying together a lot of things that maybe the folks within these different fields can't quite see. So I may be curious, as you did your research or started to do your interviews, if there were just common threads you saw that ended up being a part of the documentary series, or just interesting themes that kept cropping up that really seemed to be critical in what became the final work.
Interesting threads in regard to linguistics, or what exactly?
Yeah, I think as far as linguistics is concerned, meaning that presumably each person is an expert in their very narrow,
Yeah.
yeah.
So once the interviews were done, I mean, I didn't know what I was going to do with the stuff, right? And then I had to figure out, okay, I had to create a structure because I could have gone any which way to it. So the decision was made that it would be a chronological, I try to go chronologically. So I started with, how did language begin? And went from there, and how language changed. And, then I did one episode is just about surveying all the languages of the world, or many of the languages of the world, different from the different continents. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not. So I really, in terms of finding interesting threads that pull them together, I can't say that I really found the interesting. I had to make things fit together somehow, and it was a huge undertaking because I decided that I wasn't going to use narration at all, and so there is no narration at all, zero narration. So what it is that I use the interview footage, and the subjects narrate the film, and that's how it works. And doing it that way is a lot difficult than saying, okay, sitting down and writing an actual narration. And I hate that, so I wasn't going to do that. And so it was a lot harder to get the subjects to tell the story in the way that I wanted to tell the story. And luckily I had asked the right questions, and I was able to edit it together in such a way that it made sense, and it was told the story that I wanted to tell.
That's such a powerful idea. Why did you opt to not narrate? And what is your kind of aversion to that genre?
I don't like it. I've never used narration in any of my work, any of my documentary films before, and I really don't like this voice of God thing. And I like the naturalness of somebody talking about something that they love, and the way that flows out, more so than me writing something and having somebody read it. I think that's just so much more natural, and yeah,
I
I
know.
do
I think
better.
it really shines. It was funny. I remember, like, I think I was on like the second episode of Speaking in Tongues, and I was like, I just had that moment. I was like, there's no narration. These are all the
No, not
experts
at
speaking for
all. Yeah.
themselves.
Mm,
But it really flowed in a way that
mm.
was, really compelling. Um, Lyle asked a question that I absolutely love. Yes, also voice of God is a great way of saying that. The the overbearing narrator. Lyle had a question that I'd love to riff on because it's relevant to something you just said. But you mentioned wanting to have the answers to your questions before talking with some of these experts, and that does sound a little bit counterintuitive. Can you explain kind of what you mean by that, and why that was your
Oh, you
approach?
have to. That's like sort of like a rule of thumb almost when you're interviewing someone. You need to know what you're getting. I mean, you have to leave room for surprise and and discovery. But if you're doing your job correctly, you'll know the answers to the questions, because you want to be able to have control of the material after you capture it. And you have to have a sense of what that structure is going to be after the fact. So that's why you need to know the answers to the questions. You have to know what you're trying to achieve by by the interview, or you have to know what you want to extract from your subject. So that's why it's important to know the answers to the questions before you ask the questions.
Well, good. Okay, I'm going to break this rule entirely by asking this next one because I don't know what your answer will be. But with language in particular, it's so funny. I almost think of language like, fish think of water, or like that analogy. It's just so embedded throughout civilization and our day-to-day lives that we don't even think of it as something that was invented or created.
Right.
Um, it's just, we're almost blind to it in some sense. So I'm curious for you, maybe as you were working on Speaking in Tongues, or just generally as a writer, was there anything just that surprised you, or any big ideas that really have stuck with you since doing that project about the nature of language and about your understanding of like the function of language? And if that doesn't make sense, I'm happy to maybe
No,
elaborate, but
okay. So I don't remember if there was anything while I was working and in the mix of it, but there were things that like inspirational things that wanted me to that led me towards doing the project. So I'm always trying to find some kind of connections with with languages. For example, when I was a teenager, I spent some time in Mali, and listening to the music of Mali, it reminded me of Chinese opera. And I'm wondering, like, for me, I was wondering, is there some kind of connection between the continent of Africa, um, in West Africa, and China? And there was another thing. There was there's certain words that you wonder, you hear a word and you hear a similar word and it means a similar thing in different parts of the world, and you're wondering, is there a connection? Like che, for example. So che Rivera was like man, or I don't even know what it means in che, in the reference to che, but I heard that and it means man, or adult or something like that. So I was always trying to um make some kind of connections, because I know that we are more alike than we are unalike, like Maya Angelou says. So to me, doing the project was a way, and a lot of my work is actually about that, to proving the point that we are more alike than we're unalike, and that we have so much connections that are unexplored, yeah. So yeah, I think that's where I leave that. Yeah.
Amazing answer. Yeah, I mean, it's just, you could spend a lifetime, right, on linguistics alone and still
Hmm.
not even appreciate the depth of it.
No,
It's,
no, there's just so many, like I said, so many branches, so many fields. Yeah. So many things. Yeah.
well, that I know, and it's kind of like, maybe this will be one of the last questions I asked about the specific Speaking in Tongues project, but given that it's such a broad field, given that the history of language is such again, a big and broad undertaking, how did you decide what ultimately made it into the final series and the final product? What kind of was the editorial guide, your North Star from an editorial perspective on what made it in?
Well, there were different, well, I didn't want to get too technical, for one. I wanted it to be like, what if I were to get into phonics, for example. I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty. I wanted to relate it back to people. And that was my deciding factor. It had to relate back to some kind of the history of humanity. So when I look back on the series now, it's not only the history of language, it's the history of the human beings, and our existence on this planet. Because we talk about, the cavemans, to the history of writing, to civilization, to colonization. So all of that stuff is underlined. I use that as underlining to look at the history of language, because it is the history of the human race, essentially. So yeah.
Yeah, it really shined even in like the opening episode and the trailer of just how language has enabled all these various human ventures that just simply couldn't have happened if we were all grunting at each other.
Yeah. And so Noam Chomsky says famously is that that's what makes us human, is language, this capacity for language, for our capacity to communicate with each other and speak. So yeah, that was the underlying theme, was the history of the human race and the humankind.
Yeah, and this I promise this is my actual last question here
Okay.
is when you go to interview a Noam Chomsky, right? This is somebody who really has spent a lifetime on this one topic, and it's not that you're necessarily new after a year of research, but presumably you're still learning many things yourself. Um, what advice maybe would you give to folks who are thinking about tackling big topics, and specifically like how you went about doing research and kind of educating yourself on something so big?
How do you tackle a big topic? Is that the question? So I would answer that by saying, by making it into a small, breaking it down into the smallest components possible, and looking at it in the most simplistic ways. So a lot of times when I'm doing research, I would go to the library and get like a children's book on that particular topic, because whoever wrote that children's book is breaking it down for a child. So if you can understand it from a child's standpoint, and it's broken down to an understandable, that's how I would tackle it, just breaking it down to the simple common denominator, I guess I would say.
Whoa, that is a brilliant suggestion. I love the idea of like a children's book being
Hmm.
the ultimate distilled version of a
Yep.
topic.
Yep.
Oh my God. I'm about to like stack my library with,
Children's books.
yeah,
You learn a
yeah,
lot
with
from a
some,
children's book.
yeah, I think that's brilliant. I know it's so funny. Like with writing, we talk a lot about how oftentimes maybe we feel some pressure to like puff up our knowledge of something or appear to know more than we do, which actually often leads to like a bit language that's a little bit too complex or
Yeah,
jargony.
yeah, yeah.
And the fact, yeah, exactly. Love the children's books. Yeah. And like the fact that maybe the opposite is the highest pursuit. Can you make it simple enough for
Yeah.
to really make it approachable, and then work your way up from there? Um, Amazing. Well, I am going to ask you about something that I think is top of mind because you just did this residence. I believe it was last month in February. Um, you mentioned you had done kind of a writer's residence with Open Book, and
Mhm.
one of, I guess, the big projects you undertook in doing that was writing about writing, and specifically writing about your process as a writer. And I know much of your writing is actually kind of fiction writing, but I believe this was a nonfiction piece that you
Yeah.
wrote.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to share some of the key parts of your writing process and how you go about actually producing work.
Okay, so I am a visual writer, and I think that comes from me. And I write about this actually in the piece, so I'm just repeating what I wrote about. I'm a visual writer, and so I have to, when I'm writing, I have to be in the space. So I have to see it 360, and I have to write from the perspective of the room where I'm writing or the space that I'm writing. So it's about taking the visual cues and taking in the smells, taking in the sounds, taking all those things together and positioning myself. This is for my creative writing process. I don't do much nonfiction writing. I had to do it just for the process. So another thing I think that has prepared me to be a better fiction writer is my documentary filmmaking, actually. And so, and I actually talk about this on the post as well too. So as a documentary filmmaker, you learn to listen. You have to listen. You have to listen very, very closely. And I think my ear is in tune to how people speak from listening to people for so much. So from not only the interviews, but when you get into the editing room, you're listening to somebody say something over and over and over and over and over and over again, like ad infinitum, because you're trying to edit it and you have to listen to it and you have to find the right sections, and you're just listening to someone say, speak in over and over again. So that has attuned my ear to, I guess, to the way people speak on a natural way. And I'm also a very nosy person. So when I used to ride the subway, I haven't ridden the subway in a long time. When I used to ride the subway, I would sit there and listen to everything. I never go outside with any kind of I don't even actually own earbuds. So I'm always listening to my atmosphere, whatever is around me. And I love to listen to strangers talk to each other, and I just absorb all of that stuff, and all of that goes into my writing. So that's the kind of writer that I am, a intuitive, I guess, a naturalistic and visual writer. So yeah.
Love this idea of like listening being such a big part of,
Oh, it is a big part of writing, I would say. Yeah. Because
yeah,
sometimes you're reading novels, for example, and the dialogues just seem so stilted, and it doesn't feel natural. So it takes you out of the book, because the dialogue doesn't seem natural. So you want your readers to be with you and be to stay with you, and you do that by creating a natural space, and one that the reader feels comfortable in, and one that the reader believes. You have to create something that's believable, even if it may be science fiction, but you have to make it believable. My last book was a science fiction novel, so that's why I'm talking about that. Yeah.
yeah, it's so funny. this like, yeah, this notion of listening. I love what you said. You're like a visual writer and you like to feel like you're somewhere. I've always thought like being just very observational is a big part of being able to produce anything interesting.
Oh,
Being
for
a,
sure, for sure.
yeah, these inputs. And maybe for me, like one thing we've talked a lot about at Compound and a lot of our members think about is like, what are maybe the story, even if I'm a nonfiction writer, but like, what are some of the stories and the topics that I'm uniquely suited to write very well about? And so maybe I'm curious when you're listening, observing, looking for maybe inspiration for your next piece, how do you decide what ultimately speaks to you and you'd like to pursue further, whether that's in a book or elsewhere?
How do I decide? So I just go, it's a gut instinct. And yeah, that's how I've been operating on from, from the time that I started creating anything, is from a gut instinct. And if something, if I can feel it strongly, and I'm passionately, passionate, passion, what's the word? Passionate about it, then I pursue it. It has to it has to touch me in such a way that I want to spend my time. Like filmmaking, for example, is something that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of money. So I'm not going to pursue something that I don't love or don't want to, that I can't spend that amount of time doing. So um, I make my decisions about my film work based on things that that I know that it's going to take maybe years to produce. And so I have to have that passion from the beginning, in the middle, and the end, something that I'm really feel strongly about. So it has to just be something that touches me, that that I have some kind of connection with, obviously. And yeah.
I love with that answer because it's almost like, in some sense, I love you mentioned these things take quite a while, especially with filmmaking,
Hmm.
resources, time,
Hmm.
etc. And I think that's probably hard to stick out if you don't have that love.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, I'm curious, is this something you feel like you're often, I know you do some teaching as well, and is this something you often feel like you're helping your students find, is like locating those areas of interest and ideas? Curious if that's a theme you've picked up
Oh,
on when
for
you.
sure. Passion is number one, and I encourage passion. And it's interesting, when I entered, like I teach at Ryerson University in RTA, radio and television arts, and something very curious I saw in some handbook at the very beginning. This was like my first month there, or first semester there, and something that was very curious. It was written, these are not your passion projects. You can do that when you can do that outside of school. And I said, I was really adamant. I said, why is this written here? And what does this mean? You're supposed to be in school. This is the place where you're actually supposed to be doing your passion projects. This is where you're supposed to have the space to do whatever the hell you want to do. And here they were limiting the students, I made a big fuss about it. And now everyone's working on their passion project. So I guess I made that little shift in the program, and I'm happy for that, because yeah, if you're not passionate about it, why are you doing it, there's no reason, That's what I think. That's how I live my life, at least.
I love it. I love like that sense of having that immediate reaction. There's probably so many people who read that same slogan and didn't think twice. And
Yeah,
you had kind of this visceral reaction, like, what the hell are you talking about? This is
yeah, yeah.
right. Like I'm diametrically see this differently.
Yeah.
And and it's so funny because I think you're totally right. People kind of know when you're a gun for hire, if you will, right? If there's not a true passion at the end of the day, it's just very hard to do
Yeah,
kind of great work. And
yeah,
one
yeah.
thing I'm curious to ask you about, I feel like maybe I'm projecting, but I feel like very often we talk ourselves out of things we're actually passionate about because maybe we haven't seen a lot of other people succeed writing about this topic, or feels a little weird and on the edge of what most people talk about. Is that something you struggle with at all? Your students struggle with? And what advice would you give for people trying, maybe
Um,
developing confidence around what they're
about
passionate
dealing
about?
with their passion, they have to, I mean, I give my example. So I never shy away from my passion ever. I've never have. I'm here today because of my passion. And I say that I've been really lucky, and I don't know how many people are out there in the world that have been able to make a living from passion projects. Like all my film projects have been passion projects, and I'm lucky that I've been able to find the funding to do whatever project that I want to that I can envision doing. And I don't. What was the second part of that? The question I don't remember now. How do you?
Yeah, largely around like developing confidence. Maybe you just had it kind of since day one, but really seeing through an idea when maybe others don't quite see it yet, or sticking to your guns when you have a perspective that is a little different.
Yeah. So I can't really speak to that. Well, because I'm always hey, I'm just on the, the thing now. My daughter just came in. Yeah, so I'm always on the, I'm always encouraging anyone, my children, my students, everyone to follow their passions, right? And what was the point that I was going to make now? I can't remember what it was now. Just lost my train of thought. Oh, so there was, that's something that comes up a lot, and it doesn't have to do with confidence, it has to do with energy. So I remember one student coming to me and say, I don't feel passionate about this project anymore, I don't know if I can continue on with it. And I said to him, well, they were in the middle of editing, and they had shot a lot of footage already, and I said, you know what you need to do? You need to go deep into this thing, and then maybe you'll be able to find it back. And so the student went away and went deep into his editing, and he came back to me, maybe the next week or the week after. This was some years ago, and he said, yeah, I'm back. I'm back. I found it. And it was just getting more immersed into what you were doing, and to finding I just reconnecting with the original idea, and reconnecting with why you wanted to start the project to begin with. And that actually helped the students. So yeah, it's about immersion, and it's about, yeah, closing off the outside world and really getting into the nitty gritty of what you're doing.
Yeah, immersion. That's such a great word for some of these curiosities, because it is when you have typically I feel like passion is correlated with maybe obsession is a bit of a heavy word, but
Yeah, yeah,
the energy to go a few layers deeper on something than most
yeah,
sane people would do,
yeah,
because that's how much you care and are energized by this idea. So I love this concept of kind of immersion
yeah, yeah, yeah.
being a way to fill back up the tank.
Hmm.
So one thing I was really curious to ask you is like, I know at least in your novels and presumably in some of your documentary work, there's probably common themes or ideas or narratives that you find yourself weaving. And I'm curious for you if yeah, just like what the themes are in your work. Are there any common ideas that you find yourself trying to communicate in your writing
Yes,
and your work?
yeah. So there was this whole idea of we are more alike than we're unalike, this whole universality. So in my first novel, I talk about domestic violence and the cyclical nature of domestic violence. And I wanted to I wanted to look at it from the standpoint of, okay, it's not just certain type of women who experience domestic violence. It's women from all over the world, from all different stratas, all different classes, all different linguistic parts of the world who experience domestic violence. And so I took my mother and my former mother-in-law as an example of that. And these were two women from opposite ends of the world. My mother is from the Caribbean, St. Kitts, and my former mother-in-law was from Germany. And somehow these two women ended up in the same place at the same time, living in the same community, and both dealing with abusive husbands. And that was the starting point for my first novel, looking at these two women, and seeing how different they were, and seeing how similar they were at the same time. So that theme of universality, and the stories, how we are more alike than unalike, that drives a lot of my work. And I guess as a Black woman, um, I guess it comes back to the whole idea of seeing seeing the humanity of a person of color, because we're not seen as humans sometimes, you know. We're seen as, you know, these little niches, or, you know, we're not seeing as whole. So I guess my modus operandi, my life's work is about showing people of color, Black people, women of color, as, you know, in the full spectrum of their existence, and showing that they're full humanity. And I think that's a big part of what I do.
Beautiful. And I'm curious if like you feel that that type of work and that maybe like feel optimistic of the state of media, and like if there are more of these stories now being told than maybe there were when you first started, or if there's still so
Yeah.
much work to do with weaving some
Yeah.
of these stories and having more voices.
So I'm by nature I'm an optimistic person, but the state of affairs, the state of like the gatekeepers in all the sectors that I'm looking at working in are, you know, in the film industry, in the literary industry, they're all it's a very homogeneous white, and a lot of white females, sorry, Karens maybe have you, who are um, leading these these things, and that's who we have to deal with. And they have very little imagination, and they have very little life experience, and they have, you know, so what is being produced is reflective of that narrow life experience, and that needs to be expanded. Um, and I forgot what your question was now again.
No, that was exactly my question.
Okay, all
It's
right.
funny because, yeah, it's like on one hand, you would hope that the internet would open up, and I think in many ways it does, whatever, but open up more microphones for people to use. But you're absolutely right. There's still this very entrenched, these
Oh,
gatekeepers that,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah. And it's not changing. It's like, even with this reckoning, this racial reckoning, it's not really not changing anything, you know. People are paying lip service, and, you know, they're saying, you know, in the emails, saying Black Lives Matter, you know, sending out to their employees, but the actual nothing is actually changing within that structure, you know. So something has to be overhauled, and some real change needs to happen. And I'm encouraged because of my students now. I I'm fortunate to interact with a lot of students of color, and, you know, and I see the amount of respect and the amount of I guess just um, decency in these students. And if they're the future of the industry, I'm heartened by that, you know. But yeah, so yeah, I'm hoping that they will go into these places and change it, because they have different perspectives than the people who are currently there right now. So yeah.
beautifully said. And one, I know this is like another theme I was curious to hear about from you, is like when you have a story to tell and a message that you want to get out, obviously with the Regent Park recently undergoing many changes, shall we say, you made a documentary, and this is, I think, your most recent documentary. But you've also written novels about a lot of these, giving voices to a lot of folks. And
Mhm.
how have you kind of like, I guess, how do you decide what medium makes sense for a message, if that makes any sense at all?
Okay, okay.
You know, why
So
do a
it's
novel for one thing and not
You
a
know
documentary?
you know what's really interesting is that my very first novel started off as a film script, actually. It's always about necessity. So my very first novel, Two Women, was actually a film script that I couldn't get any funding for. And so I sat around the table with some actors, and they were reading the script. And to me, there was a lot of description in the actual script. And I said to myself in that moment, with the actors doing the table read, sounds more like a novel to me than anything else. And the fact that I wasn't getting any funding to make it, I said, okay, well, I'm just going to write a novel. And I was at a stage in my career where I was just, you know, you get tired after a while. So you just want to take a break. So I took a break. I took some years actually and started writing that first novel. And yeah, so then you write the novel and then you enter another world, like the literary world, and you realize that that world is actually worse than the film world. You make less money for one. You don't make any money at all, really. And yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, yeah,
Yeah, I'm like,
I'll continue.
have you ever dipped your toes in? We're hopelessly biased towards internet writing. Have you ever thought about dipping your toes in being more consistent, like publishing short stories on a blog or newsletter,
No,
something like
no,
that?
I didn't enjoy, like I was telling you before we started, I didn't enjoy having to write on a deadline. I don't like that.
Yeah.
I didn't like that at all. I like taking my time to write and yeah. And so the novels that I write, it takes like me 5 years to write a novel, you know? And I don't know if, yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I can spend my time making films like that. Um, but yeah, I don't know if I can do that in terms of like right on a deadline. Like say, I find it very hard to do.
I know. And this is, yeah, there's always this battle of like, do you have to pressure yourself to get things out? And that's how you get, I think it comes down to personality, but like, and that's how you just power through resistance to get things out, or do great stories and great ideas really take a while to percolate? And
Yeah, they do. Yeah, I found it so stressful having to write, you know, on okay, write on a strict okay, it has to be done at this week, and next week you have to write something else. And yeah, yeah, that's not me at all. I like to spend my time and I mean, I could write fast. I can do it, but and it's probably good still, but I just don't enjoy it. You know, I can produce the stuff and I can meet the deadlines, but I just don't enjoy working like that at all.
well, this is perfect because it segues into Lyle's question, which is a theme I was going to get into next, which is there's obviously this writing process, but there's also the editing process, which can be
Mm,
itself, you know, a curse and a blessing, if you will.
hmm
But yeah, I'll kind of riff on Lyle's question, which is just like we're curious to hear about your editing process for your books. Do you send it to a few peers for feedback on manuscript? Do you work with professional editors typically? How do you kind of refine a book or a manuscript or a story once you've written the first draft?
So, well, I never show anybody after the first draft ever. I have to like get it to a point where I'm really loving it. I spend the time, you know, a couple of years by myself, just holding it in and refining it. And then I have some friends of mine that I trust who are really good writers that I would send the manuscript to and get their feedback from, and that's how I do it. And then the two books that have been published, they've assigned editors with me, and that process was a very short process. So and it's not as detailed as the notes that I would get from my actual readers. So yeah,
Yeah, you
and
maybe
the
see.
editing, yeah, I see. No, I just saw the message. Yeah, from editing process for speaking in tongues. That's a question. So that editing process was me, and it was painstaking because I wasn't the editor. I was working with an editor, and I think that 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 film actually, I didn't enjoy the shooting process because I was working with some guys that I didn't get along with, and then the editing process was another thing I didn't enjoy, working with this particular editor and someone that I had been working with for a very long time. And I think that process of making speaking in tongues actually what broke me and told me that I needed to do something different. And so from that point on, I've been actually editing my own work, and enjoying it immensely, more so than working with someone else. So so the editing process for speaking in tongues, it was I always do like a paper edit, meaning that I have a structure that I have, and I just basically say this is how you put it together. Like I didn't do the physical editing, but I actually decided how everything was going to flow. So all the text and where to find it. So this is how you put it together. put it together here, and now we build the images on top of that. So yeah, so I was involved in every minute of that editing, but I actually didn't push any buttons. That was someone else. And it was frustrating to me that that person was only there to push the buttons. And so when I did Farewell Region, I was the one who did the editing, the physical editing, and there was no one else in the room. It was just me and my computer. And I enjoyed that more so than working with an editor.
Yeah, this is insofar as you're willing to go, what is a what does a a bad or unproductive relationship look like with an editor versus what would your ideal relationship be with an editor? That makes
Okay,
sense.
so the reason that the straw that broke the camel's back was that I couldn't trust this particular editor to 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 bring ideas. He wasn't bringing any real ideas to the process, So in my mind, I was saying, so okay, so why are you here? What if you're not bringing any ideas? If you're just pushing the buttons, because I can be doing that myself. So it's unhealthy if that person is not really collaborating with you in such a way that it's creating something better or different. So that was my biggest issue, was that the person wasn't bringing anything to the table, and I wanted to be able to step back and not be in the room. I was like getting stir crazy being in the room every single day with the editor, right? I wanted to say, okay, here, this is the footage for this scene, put it together. And coming back and not being happy with what they did, or the fact that they didn't do it, or so yeah, that was frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea level collaboration being so important, meaning
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
yeah, and that was, I guess, like, I know you mentioned now you do a lot of self-editing, but with your books or with other work that you do you have a few other writers? You mentioned you send maybe some work to get reviewed, but do you find yourself getting inspiration and seeing new directions to take things with other writers or peers of yours? Or do you feel like you mostly have your process figured out and can
Yeah,
kind
I
of just
think I'm
execute?
pretty self-contained. I like to do stuff on my own. I mean, I've only taken like this and one writing workshop. I don't know if people are keen on those, but those writing workshops, they're only as good as the writers that are there themselves. And so I took one writing workshop, and the writers in the group were actually pretty good writers, and I got some good feedback. And that was at the beginning of the process of my first novel. But I didn't like, I maybe I just don't like people, but I didn't like seeing people every week, for one. And yeah, I just had a thing that I never took another writing workshop after that. And I like the process where it's just me writing, and then I pass it over to people that I trust at the end of the writing process.
That's great. So the pandemic has been a boost for your writing then, hopefully, because
Oh yeah, I've done a lot in this pandemic. I've been very creative. Okay, so I was working on the opera that I told you about, and I finished my third novel that I'm shopping around now. This is a science fiction novel. Um, what else? I wrote a play, which I don't know what I'm gonna do with this play, which is based on the pandemic. Yeah, it's a very creative time for me right now. So, and the animation documentary, I was continuing to working on that during the pandemic as well too. And yeah, lots
God,
of
okay.
stuff.
Now I feel guilty. I thought I was being productive, but you've written a play, an opera. I think you have most of us beat. Well, as we enter our last few minutes here, there's a few more questions
Yeah.
I'd love to ask you. And actually, the opera is one of them, but I'll save that for a second. I would love to hear maybe, looking back on a lot of the work that you've done, ranging from documentaries to novels to everything in between. Is there anything, like any advice you would give yourself a few years ago, or even when you were just getting started off with either filmmaking or writing novels that, yeah, that you'd give your younger self, that you'd give anyone who's just getting started? And yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Any advice that I would give my younger self? No, somebody asked me this similar kind of questions, if I had any regrets, if I would do anything differently, and I would say no, no, because you don't. I have this thing that I say: there's no such thing as mistakes. They're just lessons. And I don't know if I read that somewhere, if I made that up. There's no mistakes, they're just lessons. So everything that I've gone through has taught me something, and I've learned from it, and I've used that to when and I've applied it to the next time I had to deal with something similar. So the advice that I would give to my younger self is just to do it. Do whatever you feel like, just do you, right? And that's what I've been doing. And that's the advice that I would give. So, but for my students, I say to them, my people who are going out into the film industry, I say, the advice that I give to them is for them to produce, because the power is in production for you to be the actual producer. Because if you're like a hired hand, if you're an editor, if you're a camera person, you're waiting for those jobs to come around. But if you're a producer, you're creating the opportunities, you're writing, you're creating and you're working with your own ideas as well too. So there's more power in that than to waiting for, a job to come around. You create your own job when you're the producer.
God, I've been taking notes feverishly here, and that just stands out as like, it's so funny now. Again, a lot of our audience is maybe writing a blog or a newsletter or publishing a lot on the internet and talk about a low barrier to entry, right? Like there's, it can be tough to get your stuff read, and there's all these challenges with distribution. But very often we are our own gatekeepers with at least the act of getting something out there. There's plenty of other obstacles to get over in doing that. But I love the idea of, don't necessarily put yourself in a position to be waiting for jobs, put yourself in a position of kind of creating them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, what a great piece of advice.
That's
all right,
how
well,
I've survived.
let's see if I can lob two more here as we wrap up. So one thing I was curious about is I think you were born in St. Kitts, right? And moved to Canada when you were younger. And so I would be willing to bet that you have a really interesting set of writers and thinkers who have influenced you that maybe even lesser known to a lot of the folks in our audience. So I'm curious to hear from you what writers or thinkers have played a big role in, your own inspiration and your own work.
Okay, I would say first would be Jamaica Kincaid. And I came across Jamaica Kincaid, like not as a young person, but as an older person. And she's actually from an island that's very close to St. Kitts, from Antigua. And reading her books, I felt that I was reading about my family and people that I knew from, St. Kitts. So that was the actual first time that I actually felt that. And I really love her work. She's a really excellent writer. So I would say Jamaica Kincaid. Of course, when I started reading more so, I was reading like a lot of Russian novelists. And then when I started making films, I really loved the early Russian cinema. So there was some kind of, maybe in my past life, I was a Russian, I don't know, but I have a really affinity for, Gogol and Eisenstein and, just in terms of the film and literary world. So my influences, so Ousmane Sembène, he's a Senegalese director. He's actually, they call him the pioneer of African cinema. And I think that was probably my strongest film influence, was probably his work. And if you look at my early work, I'm actually copying a lot of the stuff that I saw from him. So Ousmane Sembène is, and I had the opportunity to meet him 3 times before he passed. So I was lucky at that. And there's Ousmane Palissy, who's from Martinique. This is a filmmaker who I loved her first film, Rue Krasneg, which is in English, it's Sugarcane Alley. So I've had many different people that I've loved over the years. So bridging to opera now. So my love for opera came from my love of this particular filmmaker, Peter Greenaway's British filmmaker's work, who had lots of opera in it. And I think I really got to fall in love with opera through his work from film. So it's like, things going from one genre to the next genre to the, to the one platform to the next platform.
Yeah, this is actually, it's so funny. We've never talked about opera in a single interview we've done. So I refuse to waste this chance to ask you more. Such a beginner question, but like, what really feels distinct about the opera medium that you maybe can't do in a novel or you can't do in a film?
Well, so you realize that I'm not a you realize that you're writing songs because they're going to be singing the words, and I haven't grasped that idea as yet. But I can tell you the way the opera came about was that it was going to be my third novel. I was going to write it about inertia. I was going to write about people who are stuck in one place. And I started writing this book and it was just so boring. And I just, oh my God. But then I read it back and it was actually, there's some really good elements at it. So I took those really good elements and the characters were really strong because they were based on people that I had met. And so people that I had recently spent time with. So yeah, so that became the opera. But so what was the actual question? Because I wanted to, you have two
Yeah, like
minutes left.
what can you do in an opera that you can't
Oh,
do
what
in
can
other
you do?
mediums? Yeah.
So you know what I really love about working in the is learning what you can do with in a very with very few words. So when you're writing a novel, you're just writing words and words and words and words. But with opera, you have to condense those words like writing a poem. It's not poetry, but it's almost like poetry, where you're condensing the words and you're actually telling the full story within the words as well, too. So you're meaning that there's no what did I want to say? No, I'm not communicating it very well right now. But you're telling this epic story in a small amount of space and a small amount of time with a small amount of characters. So yeah, so the opera that I'm working on now is it's called Inertia, and it deals with isolation and sexuality of two elderly neighbors. And there's a character that's deaf as well too. So dealing with the the topic of mortality and yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things that I'm trying to play with in it, and it's a lot of fun. I'm having so much fun with working, and you know what, I'm enjoying working in a small in with a small amount of text because it's exhausting spending 5 years, 6 years to write a novel, But this you can change you can go through the whole thing in a week, or less than a week. So in terms of getting from the beginning to end. So I'm enjoying that, and I'm enjoying how you can create it's like almost like a short story, but it's there's more to it. So I haven't gotten to the stage where I'm actually adding music yet, but I'm looking forward. That's the next step.
Oh my God. I know I'm not ready, but I am extremely intrigued by this idea
Okay.
of opera being able to condense what would otherwise be a very verbose, if you will,
Yeah, yeah.
story. And well, okay, actually we're right over time. I've not kept us to time here, but I have a mountain of notes. I love so many of these themes. I just love and I'm going to reflect on. In particular, your commitment to passion and really
Mm,
finding and committing to those things you actually care about.
yes,
And it sounds so simple, but is worth repeating.
yeah.
And I just want to thank you for making the time to generously share a lot of hard-won wisdom with us. And
Thank you. Thank you
this is
for
such a blast.
inviting me. I enjoyed the chat.
Yes, this is a
Yes,
blast.
yeah.
And yeah, thanks everyone who joined us live. We'll send out the recording here in the next day or two. And thanks everyone who joined us for this. And Christene, again, this was an honor. I learned so much. And until next time, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Bye, everybody.
Awesome. See you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.